This lecture is a brief discussion about genetic disorders. Most disorders are complex. They are polygenic. They are multifactorial. A lot of times you can have alleles that make you more likely to have some sort of disorder, but environmental factors play a big role as well. That's not what we're talking about in this lecture. This lecture is about disorders that are caused by genetic mutations in a single gene. These genetic mutations may be inherited, they may be new mutations, but regardless, there are no cures for genetic disorders. These are things like muscular dystrophy, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs disease, sickle cell anemia. The severity of this disorder, whichever disorder it might be, really depends on the mutation. So some mutations are less harmful than others. They would have less severe physical characteristics. We're going to talk specifically about one disorder as a way to better understand these concepts. And the disorder we're going to talk about specifically is sickle cell anemia. This is a relatively common genetic condition. It's found in people with African ancestry. In the US, approximately 8% of African Americans carry a copy of the sickle cell allele. Sickle cell results in a mutation in one of the genes that makes hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the molecule in our red blood cells that carries oxygen. So if we look at the drawing on the left, you see round, normal red blood cells that have this, it's called a biconcave disc. It's a little hard to see from this image, but that darker part in the middle indicates that it's deeper down. So most of the material is in a ring around the outside, but the cell is kind of a disc shape. You can also see this on the right-hand image where the center of these round red blood cells is almost transparent. The light comes right through it. Sickle cell gets its name because when the hemoglobin is the wrong shape in sickle cell anemia, it causes the red blood cells to be the wrong shape. And you can see these are called sickle cells because the shape is like a sickle, which is a farming utensil that has a curved cutting blade on the end. Now, they're not clearly curved sickle shapes all of the time. You can see there's some diversity here. And in the right, you can see a lot of these. There's a little bit of a curve on a bunch of these, but some of them are just clearly not the normal healthy shape for red blood cells. Okay, why is this a problem? Well, sickle cells do not live as long as a normal red blood cell, which means that people who have sickle cell anemia tend to have fewer red blood cells than those who are unaffected. A low number of red blood cells is anemia, and it contributes to a lot of things, especially fatigue. The other really dangerous thing about sickle cell, these abnormally shaped red blood cells can kind of hook against each other and block blood flow in small blood vessels. The small blood vessels the capillaries are generally only big enough for a single red blood cell to slide through at a time. So what does this cause? What kind of symptoms do you get? Well, you get pain, especially in the joints, dizziness and fatigue because you don't have enough oxygen getting to your tissues, frequent infections, urinary symptoms, painful swelling of the feet and hands, and treatment can help, but there's not a cure. So you can get medications that ease the symptoms, and you can get blood transfusions to help with the anemia part. On rare occasions, you can get a bone marrow transplant. So a bone marrow transplant works for sickle cell because the bone marrow is where your red blood cells are manufactured. So if you have extreme sickle cell anemia, they can kill the bone marrow. Not remove it, you can't remove it all, but they can kill the bone marrow in your body. That is really a very hard and life-threatening procedure for you to go through. And then they can get bone marrow from a donor and inject it into your bones, specifically the femurs, the large bones in the upper leg. But it's really hard to find a matching donor, especially if you're African American. A lot of people aren't willing to donate. Well, the effects on the donor are relatively mild. It's a little harder than a blood donation, but most people only miss 1 to 2 days of work. It's really not hard at all. The life expectancy for people with sickle cell anemia is around 54 years. Individual lifespan can vary dramatically. So some people die as children, some people live a relatively normal life expectancy. But they're going to have a lot of health problems. And this also can be a contributing factor to a shorter lifespan because people with sickle cell are going to have lower incomes due to their health problems. They're going to have a harder time holding down a job. They're going to have a harder time getting health care, all of that sort of stuff. So it's not a good disease to have. The genetics of sickle cell is actually really, really interesting. 2 copies of the normal hemoglobin allele, indicated here with a capital H, produces no disease. So you can see in this Punnett square, we have 2 parents who are heterozygous. They are carriers. So they have 1 normal allele and 1 sickle cell allele. The sickle cell allele is the lowercase h. Each parent has a 50% chance of giving their offspring the normal allele and a 50% chance of giving them the sickle cell allele. So their offspring, there's a 25% chance that any given offspring will have normal, both alleles will be normal, a 25% chance that both alleles will be the sickle cell allele, and that child will have sickle cell anemia, and a 50% chance that their offspring will have the heterozygous condition, and they will be a carrier and have something called sickle cell trait. When you're a carrier and you have sickle cell trait, most people have no symptoms, but some people do have mild symptoms similar to what you'll see in sickle cell anemia, mostly with fatigue from not having enough blood oxygen, because half of their hemoglobin is abnormally shaped. Life expectancy for carriers is normal. This pattern with 25% risk for each offspring having the disease, 25% risk for them not having a disease allele, and 50% risk of them being a carrier is characteristic of a situation where one gene determines the presence or absence of a disease, and that disease allele is recessive. Okay. So, we see this genetic combination, and you would think that evolutionarily speaking, sickle cell anemia, without modern medical care, these individuals would die young and would not pass on their alleles. So why is it so common, and why does it persist? This is the fun twist to this story. Okay, fun's probably not the right word. The interesting twist. And the answer is malaria. So, malaria is a group of diseases. They occur in tropical areas worldwide, although historically malaria also existed in Europe, in North America, even in Massachusetts. But the type of malaria found on the continent of Africa tends to be the deadlier kind. So, in Africa, there was a lower survival rate of children with sickle cell anemia, but the sickle cell trait, the heterozygous condition, provides resistance to infection with malaria. Malaria is a very, very deadly disease. Up until the last 100 years or so, it probably killed about half of all humans. People with sickle cell trait, however, are more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce. So if you had 2 normal hemoglobin alleles, you were more likely to die of malaria. If you had sickle cell anemia, you were more likely to die from the anemia, and the carriers were the ones who survived. Fortunately, malaria is on a worldwide decline. We've done a lot of preventative measures to reduce mosquito populations, to reduce mosquito access to infected people as well as healthy people, and there's a vaccine. It's still very new. We don't know yet what it's going to, how effective it's going to be, but there is hope that we could eradicate this horrible disease. Okay, so that was looking at sickle cell anemia as an example of a genetic disorder. Hopefully that helps you understand how genetic disorders are passed along and persist.